Open Range is a beautifully made modern western that really pays homage to the classics, thanks in large part to the undeniable chemistry between Robert Duvall and Kevin Costner. So in this video, let's take a look at 20 things you didn't know about the movie, such as why these two were secretly in agony for most of their scenes, the iconic movie role that Kevin Costner turned down in order to star, and how Open Range secretly paved the way for Horizon: An American Saga. So Open Range was actually based on a novel called The Open Rangeman, written by Loran Payne. And although the film is a pretty faithful adaptation, the novel actually focuses a lot more on Boss Spearman than it does Charley, who in the book is a far less mysterious character, with no romantic subplot like he has in the film. Now, the reason why Kevin Costner felt that this novel would make for a great Western movie was because he very much agreed with his screenwriter, Craig Storper, who said that the book would allow a discussion about the West and the evolution of violence in the West, and really talk about friendship, love, and honor, and the immigrant experience, as all of those things were embodied in this basic story. And so, Storper adapted the novel into a screenplay, before spending 5 months working out the finer details of the story with Kevin Costner. So with the script for Open Range complete, the next step was to find financial backing to actually get the movie made. The only problem was that apparently Kevin Costner wasn't exactly in vogue at the time, and the Hollywood studios simply weren't very interested in making a Western, especially in a year full of special effects heavy blockbusters like The Matrix and The Lord of the Rings. However, Costner was still determined to get Open Range made, and decided to fund a significant portion of the film himself, saying, "I have done it before. Some of the stories I've wanted to tell weren't going to quite make it to the screen, so I just do what I can to help them get there." So with his own money invested into the movie, Costner essentially put himself in a position where he could make the film exactly the way he envisioned, free of interference from studio executives or financial backers who might have different creative priorities. Now obviously, the flip side of this was that it put even more pressure on Kevin Costner to ensure that Open Range was a success. So with everything that Kevin Costner had invested into Open Range, he obviously had to make the movie his top priority, ahead of any other opportunities that might arise for him as an actor. And because of this, he was reportedly forced to turn down an offer from Quentin Tarantino to play the character of Bill in the Kill Bill series, which ultimately went on to become a massive critical and commercial success. Although, years later, Tarantino did manage to successfully cast Kevin Costner in Django Unchained as the character of Ace Woody, who is Calvin Candy's right-hand man. But again, Costner had to depart the role because of a scheduling conflict, causing Tarantino to de-emphasize the character, who eventually became Billy Crash, played by Walton Goggins. Now when it came to the casting for Open Range, Kevin Costner opted to play the character of Charley Waite himself. But for the character of Boss Spearman, it was critical that he find an older leading man that he would have good chemistry with, who was also capable of dealing with such a physically demanding role. And for that reason, Costner set his heart on Robert Duvall, famous for his roles in The Godfather and Apocalypse Now, as well as westerns such as Lonesome Dove, True Grit, and Joe Kidd. And because of this, Kevin Costner viewed Duvall as a national treasure, and became so set on the actor for the role that he genuinely didn't know whether he would still go ahead with the movie if the actor said no. But thankfully, Robert Duvall loved the script, and said yes almost immediately, before making the role his own. Another hugely important casting in Open Range was the character of Sue Barlow, the love interest of Charley. And what Costner was looking for was an actress of a certain age who could play a woman that was just about to miss out on love, but had the self-confidence to still hold on to her pride even if she did. So for that reason, Costner decided to go with Annette Bening, as he felt that she had a quiet authority about her, and was such an experienced actress that it took the pressure off him as a director, as she always seemed to know exactly how to approach each of her scenes. So one role that Kevin Costner didn't have an actor in mind for was for the character of Doc Barlow, meaning that he had to arrange auditions for the part. And the candidate that really jumped out at him was the Canadian actor Dean McDermott, who approached the audition differently to everyone else by putting his own spin on the character, choosing to play the Doctor with a limp despite it not being called for. And this impressed Kevin Costner so much that he gave McDermott the part, and even incorporated his unscripted limp in the final film. Another actor that Kevin Costner was hugely impressed with was Michael Jeter, best known for his roles in The Green Mile and Jurassic Park 3. And in Open Range, he appears in a supporting role as the character of Percy, who Costner felt really added spice to the movie. For that reason, on set, Costner actually devised an additional scene for the character ahead of the final gunfight, in which Percy reads out his last will and testament alone in his room. And despite Michael Jeter not having a chance to practice the scene beforehand, he absolutely nailed the emotion of the scene, and even started welling up. But sadly, Michael Jeter never actually got to see this scene in the final film, as he passed away 5 months after filming, with Kevin Costner realizing in hindsight that the actor's mortality was probably subconsciously playing on his mind while filming the improvised scene, hence his tears. So, in honor of the actor, Kevin Costner included a dedication to him at the end of the film. So with the cast for Open Range decided, Kevin Costner was very keen to get all of the actors together in one place, because as a director, he'd always been a big believer in rehearsals. And so, weeks before shooting, he rented out a gymnasium to go through each scene with the actors, ironing out any issues before cameras even started rolling. He also took them out on location to give the actors a better feel for the setting, as well as giving them an opportunity to practice their dialogue against the elements, all of which massively helped when it finally came time to start filming. Another thing that was really important to Kevin Costner with Open Range was its cinematography, as he really wanted to capture the natural beauty and vastness of the West to really help immerse the audience in the time period. However, rather than going with a well-known established cinematographer, he decided instead to go with his gut, and picked J. Michael Murrow, who'd previously worked as a Steadicam operator on Field of Dreams and Dances with Wolves. So despite it being his very first role as a director of photography, Murrow was clearly the man for the job, immediately making a name for himself that led to him shooting for the likes of Crash, Longmire, and more recently Horizon, teaming up again with the director who gave him his first big break. So although Open Range never actually specifies where the movie takes place, it's pretty clear that it's set in the American West during the late 19th century. And with Kevin Costner being a big advocate for authenticity when it comes to westerns, the director had unsurprisingly hoped to film Open Range in America. But in the end, it just wasn't cost effective. He found it too difficult to find big enough areas of untouched wilderness to film in. So, out of necessity, Costner decided to film Open Range in Alberta, Canada, which actually ended up being perfect, providing plenty of wide open prairies and untouched landscapes that were exactly what he was looking for. One big issue with filming Open Range in Canada was whether it would be possible to find an Old West town that suited the look and requirements of the story. And although there are actually a number of options available, Costner just didn't feel as if any of them were the right fit, believing that a lot of them looked too much like Deadwood. So Kevin Costner decided to go all in, and spent over $1 million building a western town from scratch that was constructed in just 7 weeks. And because the location he picked was so far from civilization, he apparently had to spend an additional $40,000 just to build a road to get there. So once the town of Harmonville was fully constructed, Kevin Costner next had to think about how he was going to stage the famous flooding sequence. And although films like Pirates of the Caribbean and The Matrix were really starting to show what CGI was capable of at the time, Costner opted to create the scene with practical effects instead. And so, he had a massive water tank constructed that could pump 32 gallons of water down the street every minute, which would then be collected and recycled back to the top of the town through underground pipes. Another standout scene in Open Range that required a lot of planning beforehand was the famous final shootout. This was because Kevin Costner was committed to showing the gunfight play out in real time, with no over-stylized editing or exaggerated action, instead focusing on making it appear as authentic and intense as possible. And to achieve this, he storyboarded every moment and movement of the confrontation, filming most of the scenes in giant wide shots to capture the scale of the chaos and confusion, while burning through over 7,000 rounds of ammunition just to capture the gunfight the the way that he'd envisioned. However, the extra effort was worth it in the end, as the sequence has since become one of the most memorable of its kind in the Western genre. Although, one downside of the scene is that it's believed to be the reason why Open Range received an unwanted R rating, with Costner saying, "It didn't have any sexuality, it didn't have a language problem, I think they based the decision on our gunfight," which I think actually isn't even as violent as a lot of movies out there. So with Kevin Costner retaining so much creative control over the movie, the director was able to sneak in quite a few references and nods into the film that are pretty easy to miss. For instance, the dog in the movie is called Tig, which is also the name of Kevin Costner's production company, which are both references to the nickname that he had for his late grandma. Also, the horse that Charley rides in the movie is actually the same horse that Costner rode in the 1994 western Wyatt Earp. And the director even managed to work in a nod to Clint Eastwood with the outhouse scene, which was apparently a reference to his 1992 western Unforgiven. So there was no question that Kevin Costner was fully committed to Open Range, but in reality, he might have been just a bit too committed, with the director later revealing that he was actually in a great deal of pain the whole way throughout the shoot.
I'm pretty sick here. I actually don't even realize at this moment how sick I am. I can see my body language a little bit start to reveal itself, but my appendix was probably a couple days away from bursting.
Yet despite this, Costner refused to admit it to himself or discuss it with others, for fear that it might shut down or delay the production. And despite those around him insisting that he take a break, the director continued working, believing that it was all simply a case of dehydration. However, after filming Wrapped, his leaking appendix finally burst, at which point he realised just how serious his health issues had actually been. So although Kevin Costner did everything he could as a director to keep Open Range on track, the production very nearly got thrown into chaos by Robert Duvall, or more specifically his horse. Because one day while practicing riding, the 71-year-old actor was bucked from his horse and was immediately rushed to hospital. But luckily, the actor suffered no major injuries, despite breaking 6 ribs, which although not serious, did leave Duvall in a great deal of pain. However, the actor was fully committed to his role and the film, so he returned to set as soon as possible, and worked through his injuries, hiding his pain alongside Kevin Costner. So when Open Range was finally ready for release, apparently Kevin Costner was not happy when he discovered that Touchstone Pictures were planning on giving him top billing. Because even though Costner was the director and arguably the more relevant household name at the time, he felt that it was only right that Robert Duvall get top billing instead, out of respect for his esteemed career and the central role that he played in the movie. When Open Range did finally release in August 2003, the movie was met with mostly positive reviews, with Rotten Tomatoes currently giving it a 79% critic score and an 84% audience score. And although Open Range didn't make quite the same splash that Dances with Wolves did 13 years prior, many praised Kevin Costner for his directing, with Entertainment Weekly saying, "Costner shows an exacting instinct for how to build a shoot-'em-up from the ground up." Equally, the acting from Costner and Duvall also got a lot of praise, with The Guardian calling Open Range a truly outstanding film with great performances, particularly from Duvall. Now with that being said, not everybody was so keen on Open Range, with some criticising the movie for its poor pacing and cliched storytelling, with The Hollywood Reporter saying it has too many lengthy silences and butt-scratching pauses. But on balance, Open Range represented a big win for Kevin Costner, who'd emphatically re-established his reputation as a director after the critical and commercial failure of The Postman. So off the back of all this positive word of mouth, Open Range managed to make just over $68 million at the box office, against a $22 million budget. Now obviously this was great news for Touchstone Pictures and those who invested in the movie, but Kevin Costner was arguably the biggest winner, as he was able to make a movie that he truly cared about exactly the way he wanted, all while making a good profit and strengthening his reputation as a director. So in short, his gamble on the movie really paid off. So after Open Range, Kevin Costner threw himself back into acting, bagging high-profile roles in Man of Steel, Hatfields and McCoys, and of course, Yellowstone. So it'd be easy to assume that Costner had given up on directing, but in reality, behind the scenes, he was actually hard at work on developing another Western movie that he'd actually been working on since 1988. And thanks to the success of Open Range, Costner reportedly entered negotiations with the Walt Disney Company in 2003 to finally get his new Western made. However, during the pre-production stage, it became clear that the studio had set limits on the production budget, prompting Kevin Costner to walk away. But he never truly gave up on the film, which eventually ended up being spun out into Horizon: An American Saga, a 4-part Western movie series very much in the spirit of Open Range, once again funded, directed by and starring Kevin Costner. So it would seem that his idea was to take the same formula for success that he had with Open Range and try to replicate it on a much larger scale. Now, whether this gamble will pay off a second time around is yet to be seen, but either way, based on how the director approached Open Range, it would seem that Kevin Costner won't let anything or anyone stop him from making the movie that he wants to make. But out of interest, let me know below, what do you think was the better Western, Open Range or Horizon? And while you're here, you might also want to check out this video right here.